On the 12th of July, 2023, at 1:20 in the afternoon, a phone call was made to the Daejeon 112 Emergency Reporting Center. I am in my third year of high school, but since my birthday has not yet passed, I am 17 years old. If a student commits murder, what happens? If I confess, will I receive a reduced sentence of 5 years in prison, correct? The voice belonged to a very young-sounding female. Moreover, the voice seemed to be trembling, as if she was too nervous for it to be a prank call. The staff at the reporting center sensed something was seriously wrong and calmly asked questions to determine her location. Caller, we can only understand the situation by directly confirming the scene. Could you tell us where you are? Suddenly, there was a startled gasp as if someone was frightened. Then the call ended with the words, "I was making a prank call. Please do not come." The police immediately checked the caller's location using the mobile phone's GPS. As they were preparing to dispatch officers, not long after, a female student was brought in by her father, saying she wanted to confess. This was the very person who had made the call, Miss Park. They led the police to an apartment in Wolpyeongdong. When they entered, Miss Park pointed to a spot between the desk and the bed, which was covered with a blanket. When they removed the blanket, they found a female student lying on the floor. The police hurriedly began cardiopulmonary resuscitation and called for support from 119 emergency services. About 7 minutes later, the emergency responders arrived, but the student was already in cardiac arrest, with rigor mortis setting in, indicating she had been dead for at least an hour. The deceased student was a second-year friend at the same high school as Ms. Park. There were deep fingernail marks on her neck, showing clearly that this was not an accident, but that she had been strangled with murderous intent. What on earth had happened between these two young girls, only 17 years old? Their troubled relationship began 2 years earlier. They met through a mutual friend. After that, they became best friends, ending up in the same class in their second year of high school, which made them even closer. They exchanged dozens of text messages every day and were so close that they were almost never apart. However, 20 days before the incident, on the 23rd of June, Ms. Lee sent a message to Ms. Park saying, "Let's not meet anymore." From Ms. Park's point of view, this was a sudden and unexpected breakup, which filled her with shock and anger. Every day, she sent messages, begging, threatening, but nothing worked. Ms. Lee simply did not respond at all. In the end, on the 12th of July, Ms. Park went to Ms. Lee's house under the pretense of returning some belongings. She rang the doorbell and knocked, but there was no sign of anyone inside. Unwilling to give up, Ms. Park sat in a stairwell in the apartment, waiting absent-mindedly for her. After a while, she saw Ms. Lee's older sister leaving the house, and she thought she heard Ms. Lee's voice from inside. "So, you're in there, ignoring me all this time?" At that moment, Ms. Park's anger exploded. She began pounding on the door and shouting loudly. Eventually, Miss Lee opened the door for the last time. Despite Ms. Lee's desperate resistance, she was overpowered. Soon, the life faded from her eyes, and she stopped breathing. Her body grew cold. The whole crime took less than 30 minutes from when Ms. Park entered the house. After hearing Ms. Park's confession, the police were puzzled. A third-year high school student killed her friend just because she was cut off? And after the murder, Ms. Park's actions were even more suspicious. First, she used Ms. Lee's phone to send text messages to her older sister, pretending Ms. Lee was still alive, buying herself some time. After that, she disposed of Ms. Lee's phone and reset her own phone. It looked like she was trying to cover something up. The police suspected she was hiding something beyond her confession and decided to investigate further. Gradually, the true nature of their relationship began to emerge. They were not just friends. They were in a romantic relationship with each other. However, there was a stark difference in feelings between the two. For the victim, Miss Lee, the same-sex relationship was just a result of adolescent curiosity. On the other hand, Miss Park was almost blindly obsessed with affection. She had a history of obsessing over and stalking other girls before, and this was the same. She considered Miss Lee to be her lover and would not allow anyone else to get close to her. She wanted to know even the most trivial conversations Miss Lee had with other friends, showing very controlling behavior. Not only that, whenever Ms. Lee was late for a meeting or showed a bit of indifference, Ms. Park would become furious, verbally abusive, and even physically violent. She constantly said things like, "I am going to kill you." However, she would soon apologize profusely and beg for forgiveness, and they would break up and get back together repeatedly. In the process, Miss Lee grew increasingly exhausted. She became psychologically withdrawn and controlled, and her self-esteem declined. Yet, even though she was cornered, she could not completely cut off Ms. Park. Perhaps, caught in this repeated cycle of violence and reconciliation, she lost her ability to think rationally and could not escape. Then, on the 24th of July, 2022, the conflict reached its peak. Ms. Lee was about 10 or 15 minutes late for a meeting, and as soon as she arrived, Ms. Park hit her on the head with an umbrella, twice. This was a huge shock for Miss Lee, but as always, the two ended up going on a date at a cafe. Ms. Lee wrote in her diary that day, "It would have been better if I had died from the blow and bled to death." This shows just how unstable Ms. Lee's psychological state was. A few days later, while tidying up, Ms. Lee's mother found her daughter's diary by chance. Besides the incident above, the diary contained raw accounts of the violence, fear, and despair her daughter had endured. Ms. Lee's mother was deeply shocked and decided she needed to separate her daughter from Ms. Park as soon as possible. On the 2nd of August, she officially reported the case to the school as a case of school violence. The case was now being handled as school violence. However, Ms. Park acted shamelessly, even sending threatening messages to Ms. Lee's mother. "If you go further, you're crossing the line. I did nothing wrong. What you're doing is foolish. If you go any further, I will sue you for defamation." Ms. Park blamed everything on Ms. Lee, claiming Ms. Lee had asked her to hit her to help her come to her senses. This was a totally absurd excuse. After an investigation, the school decided on disciplinary action on the 25th of August. At the request of Ms. Lee's parents, they were placed in separate classes, and Ms. Park was required to write an official apology letter. This first-level disciplinary action is widely seen as ineffective and too mild. It's just a letter of apology or reflection delivered to the victim. The school considered separating the classes and making Ms. Park apologize as having done their duty. So the two were separated into different classes, but they still saw each other in the hallways, during class changes, and while moving around the school. Each time, Miss Lee felt fear and anxiety. She refused to go to school, and her family tried to comfort her by going on trips and offering reassurance. Then, on the 10th of March, 2023, Ms. Park contacted Ms. Lee again. "Hey, why did you report me to the disciplinary committee?" Hearing this, Ms. Lee was flustered and explained, "It wasn't me. My mom saw my diary and reported it. I was not involved." Ms. Park was briefly relieved. "So, it wasn't because you hated me." Ms. Park then begged to get back together, and eventually they agreed to see each other again. That was the beginning of the end. Things became much worse after that. Ms. Park's obsession became extreme. If Ms. Lee was slow to reply, she threatened, "I will kill you. You keep making me crazy, you stupid girl. You are useless." Ms. Park hurled abusive language at her. Ms. Lee became more and more withdrawn, only saying things like, "I'm sorry for making you angry, for not replying, for hurting your feelings, even for being useless." In this blind self-blame and constant apology, Ms. Lee lost her sense of self. Even close friends were concerned about their relationship. One friend warned Ms. Lee, "Someday she might hurt you, so stay away." But Ms. Lee was unable to escape. Moreover, Ms. Park created a list of rules for Ms. Lee to follow in their messenger chat, like a contract. Reply quickly, answer the phone, do not act on your feelings, make sure to contact me in the morning and at night. To Ms. Park, Ms. Lee was like an emotional trash can. If Ms. Lee resisted, Ms. Park responded with violence. Ms. Park even extorted money and demanded expensive gifts. Unable to endure the threats, Ms. Lee secretly took a part-time job to earn money. It must have been so hard to bear. On the 23rd of June, 2023, Ms. Lee finally met with her parents and sent a decisive message to Ms. Park: "Let's never see each other again," and firmly cut off all contact. That brings us to the events leading up to the incident. From here, Ms. Park's obsession grew to madness. She even threatened to kill Ms. Lee, but there was no response from Ms. Lee. She was behaving differently than before. On the 6th of July, Ms. Park called hundreds of times before finally reaching Ms. Lee. Ms. Park begged her to meet, but when Ms. Lee refused, Ms. Park suddenly said, "If you will not come back to me, I will kill you and then kill myself." The obsession and rage exploded. On the 11th of July, Ms. Park ran into Ms. Lee at school and greeted her as if nothing had happened. "How have you been?" That day, Ms. Park heard shocking news. Ms. Lee had a new boyfriend. Ms. Park felt deeply betrayed and sent Ms. Lee a text that night. "I have something to return to you. I will come by every day." But her real intent was different. She wanted to meet Ms. Lee alone, force her to break up with her boyfriend and come back. If Ms. Lee refused, Ms. Park planned to kill her. On the morning of the 12th of July at 10:43, Ms. Park arrived at Ms. Lee's apartment. As explained at the beginning, she waited in the stairwell and then almost forced her way into the house. "How could you see another boy behind my back? Break up with him right now," she screamed, but Ms. Lee firmly told her to leave. In that moment, Ms. Park grabbed Ms. Lee by the neck and strangled her. Ms. Lee struggled, but she could not escape. After the crime, Ms. Park considered taking her own life, but became too afraid. Instead, she decided to destroy evidence. She texted Ms. Lee's older sister, removed the SIM card and threw it away in an underpass, and tried to reset the iPad, but could not unlock it. Then, leaving Ms. Lee's body in the apartment, Ms. Park calmly walked away. At the same time, she searched for the sentence for murder committed by a minor on her phone, then called 112, but hung up in fear of being tracked. In the end, she called her father, who strongly urged her to turn herself in, and she did. However, she seemed to show no remorse. After being arrested, she asked her parents to deactivate her social media accounts and begged them to hide her iPad to destroy evidence. But the police managed to recover everything, including the iPad, which contained 1,700 messages exchanged over 4 months, clearly showing Ms. Park's obsession, violence, and gaslighting, a record of her abusive behavior. In January of the previous year, 2024, the first trial was held. At the time of the incident, Ms. Park was 17 years old, legally a minor. The case went to the juvenile court. Ms. Park claimed the murder was unplanned and that she performed CPR after realizing what she had done. Her lawyer argued that the terrifying text messages sent to the victim were typical among teenage couples, an unbelievable claim. The perpetrator's family also insisted the two girls were such close friends, there was never any intent to kill. The core issue in the trial was how Ms. Park entered the house. The victim's family claimed that Ms. Park broke in by using the door's password, which she had written in her notebook and saved as a photo on her phone. However, when Ms. Park accompanied the police to the scene to confess, she claimed Ms. Lee had opened the door for her, even though she knew the password. Since there was no decisive evidence, the court ruled there was insufficient proof of illegal entry and concluded the murder was not premeditated. Because Ms. Park turned herself in, had no previous record, and was a minor with a high possibility of rehabilitation, she received a sentence of 15 years maximum, 7 years minimum. However, after the verdict, Ms. Park filed an appeal even faster than the prosecution and submitted a letter of apology, also writing to the victim's family. Yet, the letter contained words like, "If you want me dead, I will die now," which seemed like another form of emotional manipulation and an attempt to reduce her sentence. In June of 2024, the appellate court reviewed the case. Ms. Park continued to insist it was a sudden crime and showed no true remorse, only hoping for a lighter sentence. The second trial court, however, noted that Ms. Park had threatened to kill Ms. Lee several times before the crime, which proved clear intent. Therefore, the court ruled out the possibility of an unplanned killing and sentenced her to 15 years in prison. That means 15 years in prison. The victim's family may or may not find this outcome satisfying, but since Ms. Park was 17 at the time, she will be released in her 30s. At the first trial, Ms. Park's family had offered the victim's family 70 million won, about 51,000 US dollars, but the victim's family refused to accept it. No amount of money could console the grief of losing a child. The family hated Miss Park, but also blamed themselves, wishing they had been more decisive when they learned of the school violence, thinking they might have saved their daughter. Before meeting Ms. Park, Ms. Lee had been cheerful and lively. After meeting her, her life collapsed and her self-esteem suffered. But just days before her death, she told her mother, "Don't worry, I will be fine," and smiled. In the end, she could not escape from the darkness. In my view, Ms. Park's actions were obviously criminal, but the school and society failed her as well. It is heartbreaking that neither the school nor society was able to protect her. On the afternoon of February 13, 2007, police officers began to gather in the vicinity of a military base in the city of Goyang, Gyeonggi Province. Shortly thereafter, a forensic team arrived, and upon excavating several patches of earth, they uncovered parts of a dismembered body. Today's case is one of dismemberment. However, this incident stands apart from the usual occurrences of its kind. It is far more brutal than any prior case in the country. At the time of discovery, the body was entirely dismembered, making it impossible to ascertain the original form or any details about the deceased. Once some of the pieces were pieced together, it became possible to identify the skull, sternum, and pelvic bones. After unearthing another pit, additional remains were found. In total, 82 fragments of remains were discovered across this mountainous area. The body had not only been dismembered, but had been reduced to extremely small pieces. Such an extreme case of body dismemberment is rare in the annals of forensic history. The victim, who suffered such brutal treatment, was a woman in her 20s, surnamed Ryu, who had been residing in Daegu at the time of her disappearance. Ryu went missing 3 weeks prior, on January 27th. On that day, she had traveled to Ilsan, Gyeonggi Province, to meet her boyfriend, and after that, she vanished. The last person to see her was her boyfriend, Kim. According to him, they met on January 27th and spent time together, and on the evening of January 28th, around 7 p.m., Ryu said she would take the KTX train back to Daegu. He accompanied her to the entrance of the platform at Seoul Station. That was the last time he saw her. However, her parents noticed she did not return home and filed a missing person report on January 30th. 6 days after her disappearance, on February 2nd, her family received a strange message from her. Ryu's older sister received a text that read something like, "Here the phone is the same. I don't know exactly where I am." It appeared like some sort of encrypted text or error. The police attempted to decode the message as thoroughly as possible and concluded that the likely text was, "Seems like I'm in Chollado, don't know where I am." It seemed there were typing errors, which might indicate she was in a very hurried and dangerous situation. This suggested that her disappearance was unlikely to have been voluntary and was most likely linked to a crime. The police immediately began tracking the location of her phone, and its signal was detected in Gwangju, Jeollado. A special search team was assembled, which commenced active efforts to locate Ryu. However, oddly enough, in the Gwangju area, there was not a single person who had seen Ryu. When the investigation hit a dead end, the police decided to focus on Ryu's circle, especially her boyfriend Kim, who was the last person known to be with her. Kim indeed aroused significant suspicion. However, his statements were very consistent. Moreover, we know Ryu sent that mysterious message. The police also checked Kim's phone location on the day in question, and found that he was at home in Ilsan, Gyeonggi Province. Thus, he had a solid alibi, and it seemed impossible for him to have sent the message instead of Ryu. Nevertheless, the police continued to suspect Kim, and they had their reasons. The primary suspicious fact was his credit card activity on the morning of Ryu's disappearance. On that day, Kim used his card to purchase several items: a blender, towels, a bathroom brush, and cleaning supplies. These were all ordinary household items, each with its typical use. However, when considered collectively, they raised suspicion. So a few days later, on February 13th, the police went to Kim's apartment in Ilsan, Gyeonggi Province. If a crime had indeed occurred, Kim's apartment might have been the scene. Therefore, a forensic examination was conducted. However, shortly after the investigation began, something astonishing was discovered. Traces of blood were found in the living room, kitchen, and bathroom. A particularly large amount of blood was found on sharp tools, such as a knife and a saw blade. Furthermore, traces of blood were also discovered in the recently purchased blender. As expected, DNA analysis revealed that all the blood belonged to the missing Ryu. Blood on a knife or blade could be explained, for instance, by a hand cut, but traces of blood in a blender raised enormous suspicions. This became almost irrefutable evidence that Kim was somehow connected to Ryu's disappearance. With all this evidence collected, the police began to intensely interrogate Kim. Eventually, a shocking confession came from his lips. He had dismembered his girlfriend Ryu and disposed of the remains by discarding them near a military base. This revelation came on the 19th day after her disappearance. Let's delve a little deeper into the criminal Kim. At that time, he was 32 years old, serving as an active-duty sergeant stationed at an army base in Gyeonggi-do. In November 2004, he met Ryu through a mutual acquaintance, and they started dating. By the time of the incident, they had been together for 2.5 years. A couple in their 30s was likely serious about their relationship, and 2.5 years is not a short period. During that time, Kim had also become close with his girlfriend's family. No one could have imagined that Kim would end up killing Ryu. However, in reality, Kim's inner world was far more brutal and vile than anyone could have guessed. Only Kim and his girlfriend Ryu knew the true extent of it. Ryu suffered from psoriasis, a chronic skin condition, but Kim often insulted and humiliated her because of it. These insults were not just unpleasant jokes. They were true affronts to her dignity. He would say things like, "Looking at your skin ruins my mood." How could someone speak like that to their girlfriend? It's unclear why he started dating her in the first place if he felt that way about her condition. These humiliations and insults about her skin grew increasingly vicious, and every time they met, it would lead to arguments. Their relationship was already on the brink of collapse. On January 27, 2007, the day of the incident, Ryu went to Seoul without notifying her boyfriend in advance. She wanted to discuss whether she should continue her relationship with this man and even possibly marry him, and she decided to have this conversation face-to-face. When she met Kim, he immediately started yelling at her and swearing. He asked, "Why did you come without warning? And did I really have to meet you at the station? That's so annoying." Everything seemed to irritate him. His actions demonstrated just how much he disregarded Ryu. Despite this, they went to Kim's apartment, and by then, it was already the morning of January 28th. Kim was still in an agitated state and began arguing with Ryu again. It all started with her skin condition. Exhausted and drained, Ryu uttered, "Enough already, a stone thrown in jest can still kill a frog." To which Kim retorted, "What, are you a frog? More like a pig." The argument dragged on, and at 1:47 a.m., Kim mentioned he was hungry and ordered some pork balsam. He offered Ryu to join him, but given the circumstances, having an appetite was out of the question. She declined, and Kim resumed his insults. Ryu then quietly asked, "How many headache pills does it take to die?" Kim sarcastically replied, "No one dies that easily." Ryu pressed further, "Do you want me to die?" Kim responded, "Do whatever you want." Kim claims he initially brushed off her words, but then witnessed Ryu actually taking the pills. According to him, she swallowed 15 headache pills and 50 nicotine gum tablets, a total of 65 tablets. Then, he says, she began to convulse, vomit, and have trouble breathing, eventually ceasing to breathe altogether. Up to this point, this is Kim's account. Since this occurred in an apartment with no witnesses, we can't know for sure what transpired between them, which is the most tragic aspect of this case. Kim insists he never killed Ryu, claiming she took the pills herself and passed away. Yes, that's possible. But now we're dealing with dismemberment. If his girlfriend was truly in critical condition, why didn't he call emergency services at 119? Instead, he chose to dismember the body. When asked why he didn't seek help, Kim answered that he feared being accused of murder. So what happened next? After Ryu passed away, around 5:50 a.m., Kim began dismembering her body with a knife he found at home. By 7:47 a.m., roughly 2 hours later, Kim realized the knife wasn't sufficient. He decided to look up the opening time of the nearest supermarket online. Upon leaving the house, he discarded Ryu's pants and shoes in a recycling bin. He then went to the supermarket and purchased a saw, cleaning supplies, and a blender. Returning home from 10:30 in the morning until 5 o'clock in the evening, he was solely engrossed in the gruesome task of dismemberment. Kim methodically began to dismember the body. He placed chunks of flesh into a pot and boiled them, then pulverized them in a blender. The larger bones were cut with a saw. He even snipped off all the hair from the head using kitchen scissors, doused it in alcohol, and set it ablaze to eliminate any DNA evidence. This was meticulously planned. He aimed to eliminate any possibility of leaving a trace. This was once his partner, a woman he was close to, yet he treated her with such brutality. He packed all the body parts into Ziploc bags, and then at 7 o'clock in the evening, he got into his car and drove to Seoul Station. There, he went into the men's restroom on the first floor and flushed some of the remains down the toilet. He then proceeded to a bathhouse and disposed of more remains in the toilet there, but that wasn't enough. Returning home, he continued to break down the body into even smaller pieces and placed the remains into 12 bags. He ventured alone into the mountainous area near a military base and dug several holes. He then distributed the remains, the head, ribcage, and pelvic bones, into different graves. As I describe this, it's difficult to fathom that such a thing is even possible. It's something that evokes horror, and it's hard to believe it actually took place in South Korea, and isn't just part of another episode of Saturday Night Mysteries. This was an unprecedented case of body destruction and disposal. Finally, Kim lied to Ryu's family and the police about her last known activities. Remember the text message that was sent in her name? It was he who sent that very message, attempting to confuse the investigation and convince everyone that she was somewhere in Jeollado. That message, here in Jeollado, was actually written and sent by Kim himself. How did he manage this without arousing suspicion? He left his own phone at home in Ilsan and traveled to Gwangju, Jeollado, with Ryu's phone. There he sent the message, deliberately making mistakes so it appeared as though it was sent by someone in a panic and dangerous situation, and then returned home. This created the impression that his phone had been in Ilsan the entire time, thereby reinforcing his alibi. This was indeed a meticulously malicious plan. It's important to note that Kim served in a medical battalion for 12 years, which might have equipped him with certain skills in handling a body that ordinary people lack. Yet despite this, why did he choose such a brutal method to dispose of the body? That remains a mystery. Moreover, Kim persistently claims he did not kill Ryu, asserting she died from an overdose of headache pills. But if he truly didn't kill her, then why dispose of her body in such a gruesome manner? It simply doesn't add up. When the trial began, certain issues arose. Kim admitted to dismembering the body and disposing of the remains, but the degree of dismemberment was so extensive that it was impossible to determine the exact time and cause of Ryu's death. Everything we know about the sequence of events was reconstructed solely based on Kim's testimony, and his statements remained consistent. Yes, I dismembered and disposed of the body, but I did not kill her. He even claimed that he attempted to save her by performing CPR when she lost consciousness. He asserts that when Ryu stopped breathing, he performed artificial respiration, and then, believing she was dead, decided to dismember her body? It just doesn't make sense. Clearly, he was trying to avoid a murder charge. Astonishingly, at the first hearing in the military court, his claims were accepted, and he was sentenced to 15 years of imprisonment. This meant he was only charged with negligent homicide, for failing to provide sufficient help to avert death, thereby reducing the degree of his guilt. At this point, the prosecution appealed, and in the appellate court, the verdict was altered. The higher court recognized that Kim had indeed committed premeditated murder, and that dismembering the body into over 80 pieces was a clear attempt to conceal the crime. Furthermore, during additional forensic examinations, traces of blows were found on the victim's skull, and her teeth were broken, indicating violence. Thus, he was found guilty of murder, and the sentence was changed to life imprisonment. Can such a crime result in merely a life sentence? It has been 16 years since Kim Jung-sar's crime. What if, after serving 20 years in prison, he proves to be a model inmate and is granted parole? He could soon be free. We might find ourselves sharing society with such individuals. As is well known, South Korea is effectively a country where the death penalty is not enforced. As of 2023, in the past 5 years, only 4 death sentences have been handed down at the initial hearings, and in none of these cases did the Supreme Court uphold the death sentence. I'm not an unequivocal supporter of the death penalty, but sometimes I wish that criminals like Kim Jung-sar lived in constant fear of death, because it provides a sense of satisfaction. Moreover, I endorse the idea that such brutal criminals should be completely isolated from society. Of course, the death penalty remains a complex issue, but I hope the state makes a wise decision in the direction of genuinely protecting its citizens. The man currently being escorted by police officers just uttered the following words during an interrogation. "If I hadn't been caught, I probably would have killed 1 or 2 more people." These words were spoken with an utterly indifferent tone, and the person who said them is 25-year-old Kim Yoon-chul. He was an ordinary office worker with a rather sociable nature. Before his arrest, he worked at a company selling computer components, earned a stable salary, and was even preparing for his wedding. He had already met his fiancée's parents. Within his family, he was a caring son who respected his parents. And his criminal record? The only offense he had ever been held accountable for was a traffic violation in his teenage years, which resulted in a fine of 200,000 won. At first glance, no one would have ever suspected that Kim Yoon-chul was a ruthless serial killer. Yet he led a flawlessly double life. It all began on May 15, 2006. On that night, around 11:50 p.m., Kim Yoon-chul, having spent the evening drinking with a friend in Anyang, was making his way home when he happened to encounter a 22-year-old office worker by the last name of Yoon. With an exceedingly friendly expression, he offered, given the late hour, to give her a ride if they were headed in the same direction. With such a confident smile, Kim didn't seem like a significant threat to Yoon, and feeling at ease, she got into his car. But this was the beginning of a tragedy. After some time on the road, Kim Yoon-chul suddenly veered the car in a direction that did not align with Yoon's home. The surprised young woman asked where he was going, and at that moment, Kim's demeanor changed drastically. He drew a knife he had prepared in advance and began to threaten her. He then stopped the car in a deserted area and assaulted her. Afterward, taking her belongings and credit card from the terrified Yoon, he also extracted her PIN code. The thought hit him. Damn, she saw my face. Kim suddenly grabbed her underwear and shoved it into her mouth to silence her cries, then bound her with a nylon cord he had in the car. He wrapped her face with packing tape several dozen times, leading to her suffocation. She died without even being able to scream properly. The entire ordeal, from the abduction to the murder, took Kim less than 2 hours. In fact, from the moment the threats began, Yoon had attempted several times to call her boyfriend and the police on 112. The calls lasted between 3 to 10 seconds, but unfortunately, help did not arrive in time. Meanwhile, Kim Yoon-chul began searching for a place to conceal the body, driving around the city of Gunpo for an hour in search of a suitable spot. Eventually, he found an inconspicuous location behind Gyumjeong Station, a gap between the station and the road, where he hid Yoon's body. 2 days after the first killing, on May 17th, Kim Yoon-chul withdrew a total of 2.84 million won from Yoon's credit card in 13 transactions. Out of this sum, he gave his girlfriend 1 million won, as if out of some twisted sense of nobility, and spent another 700,000 won on a car loan payment. When withdrawing the money, he deliberately used the ATM at Sambong Station, a place always bustling with people, knowing in advance that the surveillance camera there was a fake and didn't actually record anything. Later, when the police checked the withdrawal records and attempted to obtain footage from the camera, they couldn't catch a glimpse of his face. At dawn on May 20th, 5 days after Yoon's murder, Kim Yoon-chol returned to the spot behind Geumjong Station where the body was hidden. It is believed that he set the body on fire, intending to completely erase any traces. The fire department responded to the call, discovering the charred remains, but visual identification was impossible. Later, through forensic examination, using fingerprints and past dental records, it was established that the remains belonged to the missing Yoon. Meanwhile, Kim Yoon-chol returned to his routine life. The day after the murder, he took the camera he had taken from the slain Yoon and went on a date with his girlfriend to a folk village. He actively photographed his girlfriend with that camera, then brought it to work, almost boastfully showing it to his colleagues. He photographed his coworkers and even took selfies. The murder, the date the following day, and then returning to work, this entire double life continued. On the night of June 9, 2006, at precisely 11:30 p.m., Kim Yoon-chol ventured out onto the streets once more, driving through the area near Sambong Station, hunting for a new victim. Eventually, his gaze settled on a 20-year-old college student with the surname Kim, who appeared somewhat vulnerable. Approaching her under the guise of offering assistance, he suggested giving her a ride home, given the lateness of the hour. She accepted, climbing into his car, and soon they were engaged in conversation. She spoke of her boyfriend, her life at university. It was casual chatter that stretched on for a lengthy hour and 40 minutes. At one point, she began speaking to a friend on the phone, mentioning only, "Oh, I'm on my way home." However, the facade soon shattered as Kim Yoon-chol revealed his true intentions. He began to make unwelcome advances towards her. Terrified, the young woman attempted to quickly escape the vehicle, but Kim Yoon-chol brandished a knife, threatening her. In a horrific turn of events, the 20-year-old Kim met the same brutal fate as Yoon before her. The reason was simple. She had seen his face. During later interrogations, Kim Yoon-chol claimed that at the time, Kim had no credit card on her, and only a meager 10,000 won in cash. He also insisted that she had fiercely resisted his attempt to violate her, leading him to abandon the effort. Nevertheless, the body of Kim, discovered later, bore unmistakable signs of assault. On July 3rd, 3 weeks after her disappearance, Kim's body was discovered nude, curled in a fetal position amidst the overgrowth near the cemetery in the Cheonggye-dong district of Uiwang. There was a deep slash on her thigh, as if inflicted by a sharp knife, her hands were bound, and her face was wrapped in tape. Kim Yoon-chol denied any post-mortem mutilation of the body, yet the autopsy results revealed that such wounds could not have been caused by insects or accidental circumstances. They were inflicted deliberately. With the discovery of the bodies of 2 women killed in a similar manner, panic began to spread throughout the area. These 2 murders occurred less than a month apart, and it became apparent that no one knew when and where the 3rd murder would occur, creating a dangerous situation. The 2 women were strangers to each other. There were no witnesses, no surveillance footage, no clues to track down the perpetrator. The police were facing serious challenges. And then a 3rd victim emerged. On July 1st, around 11 p.m., a 27-year-old woman by the surname Ho was returning home from the Sambong district in the city of Gunpo. Kim Yoon-chol seemed to feel a certain confidence, believing he had executed the previous 2 murders perfectly. Thus, this time he acted even more audaciously. It is known that serial killers grow bolder and more vicious with each crime. This was precisely what happened with Kim Yoon-chol. This time, he immediately used force to compel Ho into his car. He then killed her in the same manner as his previous victims and disposed of her body. But this time, he took one item from the slain Ho, a Gucci handbag, a woman's handbag, and Kim gifted this bag to his girlfriend. It's simply shocking. Meanwhile, the police, who were on the hunt for a serial killer, decided to employ a clever tactic. The criminal was aware that the ATM camera, from which he withdrew money using the card of his first victim, Yoon, did not record video. This was precisely why he chose to withdraw money there. The police speculated that he might use the same location again to withdraw money from the cards of other victims. They promptly replaced the camera with a fully functioning one and waited. Their hunch proved correct. Kim Yoon-chol returned to that very spot with the credit card of his 3rd victim, Ho. This occurred 2 days after her disappearance on July 3rd, even before her body was discovered. The camera captured Kim Yoon-chul withdrawing 1.2 million won from her card. The police swiftly identified him and managed to apprehend Kim early the following morning in the parking lot near his home. Upon his arrest, Kim Yoon-chul vehemently denied his involvement in the crimes. Despite the fact that his face was caught on the ATM camera and the police already had evidence in hand, he insisted, "It wasn't me." However, a decisive piece of evidence soon emerged that broke his resistance: the results of a DNA analysis conducted by the National Forensic Service. Well, the DNA matched perfectly. Only then did Kim Yoon-chul begin to confess to his crimes, but even then, it wasn't the whole truth. As previously mentioned, at the time of his arrest, the body of the third victim, Ho, had not yet been found. Kim Yoon-chul remained obstinately silent about Ho's fate. Despite the fact that the last card used belonged to her, he refused to answer any of the police's questions about her whereabouts or what had happened to her. However, eventually, just an hour before the press conference on July 5th at 2 p.m., Kim Yoon-chul requested a meeting with the investigator and confessed to killing Ho and disposing of her body. The police immediately identified the location and headed there. That very day, in the thickets near Baekwoon Lake in the city of Uiwang, Ho's body was discovered. Her body bore signs of assault. Thus, within 46 days, 3 murders of women in the Gunpo and Anyang areas, committed by Kim Yoon-chul, were solved. By day, he appeared to be an ordinary office worker, a caring son, and a gentle boyfriend. But by night, he stalked women, raped them, and brutally killed them by wrapping their faces with tape. And yet, as mentioned earlier, he had no criminal record. However, labeling his actions as rookie crimes was impossible. His method was too brutal. The police were left wondering how a person could suddenly transform into such a violent criminal and what had triggered it. According to Kim Yoon-chul himself, he was drowning in credit card debt to the tune of 10 million won, and he claimed his criminal activities were a desperate measure to tackle this issue. But was this the whole truth? At the time, his annual income was around 28 million won, and his parents were financially stable. In the months leading up to his crimes, he even purchased a car in his father's name. Kim Yoon-chul stated that he was shelling out approximately 1.6 million won each month to cover the car loan and to chip away at his credit card debt, leaving him strapped for cash. Previously, he managed to scrape by borrowing money, but he reached a breaking point and decided he could no longer go on that way, leading him to commit these offenses. But let's pause for a moment. If his motives were purely financial, why then did he rape his victims? The answer to this unsettling question began to emerge during the search of his home. Investigators uncovered several dozen pornographic materials, which made his proclivities glaringly apparent. The majority of the videos depicted women bound with tape or subjected to coercion and violence, along with scenes where women were in pain and unwilling to engage in sexual acts. Based on these finds, the police surmised that Kim Yoon-chul was enthralled by sadistic sexual acts and used these materials to fuel his criminal fantasies. Furthermore, during his childhood, he harbored feelings of injustice, believing his mother consistently favored his older brother. This may have sown the seeds of a latent hatred toward women, which festered and grew over the years. Though Kim Yoon-chul maintained that his crimes were driven by financial woes, the sheer brutality of his actions suggested otherwise, prompting a myriad of theories and analyses regarding his true motives. This meant that his cruelty was excessive. Moreover, Kim Yoon-chul himself dared to say, "If I hadn't been caught, I probably would have killed 1 or 2 more people every month." This suggests that his motives likely extended far beyond money and were tied to an abnormal sexual obsession, or even a passion for the very act of killing. In fact, Kim Yoon-chul admitted that with each murder, he became more engrossed in his crimes. After the first one, he didn't realize it yet, but upon killing the second victim, he experienced an indescribable thrill. So, did he show any signs of remorse during the investigation? No. He said, "I feel sorry for the victims, but I was only concerned about the consequences for myself. I was afraid that if my girlfriend, colleagues, friends, or family found out about my crimes, it would harm me, and therefore I couldn't act otherwise." Doesn't that statement seem incredibly self-centered? Kim Yoon-chul thought only of his own interests and showed absolutely no empathy for the victims he killed without any reason, whose deaths were so unjust. In fact, the most chilling aspect of this case was his double life. After the murders, he photographed his girlfriend with the victim's camera, flaunted this camera in front of his colleagues, and even gifted his girlfriend a Gucci bag he took from the third victim. Such a duplicitous nature. No one would ever want to have such a person around. But precisely because of this, no one could have imagined that he was a serial killer. Let's sum it up. After extensive legal proceedings in June 2007, the Supreme Court sentenced Kim Yoon-chul to life imprisonment. He has now spent 16 years behind the cold prison walls. Technically, he has the opportunity to apply for parole starting in 2026, but given the severity of his crimes, it's said that his chances are exceedingly slim. Throughout his arrest and the entire trial, Kim Yoon-chul reportedly showed little remorse. His apologies to the press appeared more formal than genuine. Yet even if he spends the rest of his life in prison, will he ever truly grasp the horror and fear experienced by the 3 women he killed in their final moments? 16 years have passed, and it's uncertain if anything has changed. One can only hope that he lives each day fully aware of the gravity of his crimes, earnestly repenting,